When it comes to liberty, does it make any difference whether Joe Biden or Donald Trump is elected president? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's segment of The Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's segment of The Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you uncompromising principles of libertarianism. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who's a professor of economics at the Citadel and a longtime uncompromising principled libertarian himself. Richard?
Good to be with you and our viewers and listeners for another round of LA.
Yeah, great to have you all. And again, come to our website at ff.org. If you're new to FFF, if this is your first exposure, we got 30 years of solid, uncompromising, principled perspectives on libertarianism. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. Okay, so Richard, we got a big presidential election, a circus that takes place every 4 years. We've got Donald Trump for the Republicans and Joe Biden for the Democrats. This is the best they could do, both parties. Really kind of a sad state of affairs in America. But the saddest part of it is it really doesn't matter who's elected. I mean, oh yeah, the Democrats and Republicans are all fighting over each other and saying, oh, there's these big differences. There really fundamentally isn't any difference at all. And this is what I think just doesn't dawn on either the Trump supporters or the Biden supporters or just mainstream Americans that are just still trying to make their mind up. Well, as they're trying to make their mind up, let me just say real bluntly to you, it doesn't matter. Whether Trump's elected or Biden's elected, you're still going to get the same thing, which is massive chaos and massive crisis. Now, why is this? Well, it's a systemic problem. You've got a government that's doing things that it shouldn't be doing. And so therefore, it doesn't matter who's elected, because whoever manages a defective system is going to end up with crises and chaos. And in a larger perspective, what I'm talking about is the welfare state way of life. This is the so-called entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid being the premier crown jewels of this system. It's a crooked system. It's a corrupt system. It's based on the idea that government force should be used to take money from people to whom it belongs and give it to people to whom it does not belong. And it's really just legalized theft. And yeah, I know people try to rationalize it on Social Security and say, oh, I put it in, Jacob, I put it in. But all that money is spent. I mean, from the very beginning, it's been a welfare program. And the courts have held it's a welfare program. The law says it's a welfare program. And that's why you could abolish it today and nobody could sue and say, oh, you broke the contract and all this sort of thing. So you've got that system that's going to continue. And then you've got, of course, all the other transfer programs in the welfare state, farm subsidies, education grants, foreign aid, the whole nonsense. Then you've got the warfare state or the national security state, foreign interventionism. All those troops got to be paid. All those weapons that are being used up got to be replaced. Those bullets have to be replaced. The bombs have to be replaced. I mean, we're talking probably 20 to 30% of the budget there. I mean, there's let's say 50% for the welfare state, 30% for the warfare state. There's 80% right there. That's not going to change. Whether Biden or Trump gets in, they both are fiercely committed to the welfare state way of life and the warfare state way of life. And then on top of that, you've got the managed economy, the managed healthcare system, which of course we've seen the fiasco that is with respect to this pandemic. And you've got the management of the monetary system, the Federal Reserve, the management of the immigration system with ICE and whatever the department they call that handles immigration. I mean, this country is in bad shape. Everywhere you look, there's crises, there's chaos. And this is not surprising because you've got a bad system, a system that violates really the founding principles of this country. I mean, it's not a coincidence that Americans for more than 100 years live without these types of things, without a welfare state, without mandatory charity, including Social Security and Medicare, without a drug war, warfare state, foreign interventionism, on and on, immigration controls. And so that's a clue as to what we need to get out of this thing. But that's what we need to do, Richard. We need to raise people's vision, not to getting better people in public office, but to change the system so that it doesn't really matter who's in public office, because now we've got a system that's based on liberty, peace, prosperity, and harmony. What do you think?
Well, I think that you're being a little unfair. There are major differences between Biden and Trump. First of all, Biden spends his time hiding in a bunker in his home. Trump, on the other hand, goes out and waves and talks to people without a mask while he's fully contagious with the coronavirus. I mean, there are differences between these two guys, okay? And I don't think you should downplay those things. Bunker man and, shaking hands man. I mean,
Corona man.
Corona man. I mean, I think you have to pay attention to these differences. That's what we're choosing between here, okay? So, but on a more serious note, oh no, do I have to be on a more serious? They both reflect variations of the same ideological theme that America has come to at this point. It has been a very long time since the average American has been challenged to or has chosen to reflect upon what is the nature of a free society. What do we mean by rights? What is the role of government in society? And the fact is that for a century now, there has been a growing incremental change in how people have viewed government in society and their relationship to others in society. 100 years ago, or let's even be more fair, about 120 years ago, the beginning of the 20th century, most Americans would have believed that the place of government in society was basically to secure their life, their liberty, and their honestly acquired property. Low taxes, and in 1913, the only sources of revenue that the federal government had were some import duties, excise taxes on what today we call sin products, alcohol and tobacco, and land sales out west. And the total amount of the government's take at all levels of government was approximately 8% of what we now call gross domestic product. And out of that 8% of the economic pie that the government absorbed, only about 3% was taken by the federal government. In fact, at that time, the largest fraction, 5 out of the 8%, were state and local governments. The presumption was that government had no duty or responsibility to basically regulate industry. Had there emerged some regulatory agencies already, as far back as 1877 with Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate the railroads? Yes. And there was talk about other regulatory infringements and antitrust regulations. But in comparison to now and over most of the 20th century, the general consensus that unless there was an exceptional circumstance that people would debate about, the default position was that government's duty was to leave individuals free in their peaceful and honest liberty to go about their affairs as they chose in voluntary association with their neighbors, both inside and outside of the marketplace. The belief was that individuals had certain inherent rights, that it was not the duty and the responsibility of the government to interfere with, those captured in the Declaration of Independence. There were notions of self-responsibility, and that people do fall upon hard times, often not of their own making, and we all should have a sense of charity and philanthropy. Saved by the grace of God go I, and therefore we help through voluntary, charitable, and other associations and outreaches. But these are not the duties of the government. A free society is of free and responsible human beings. That began to be eaten away. The progressive era in the early part of the 20th century, a major leap with the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt during the 1930s, Truman's Fair Deal, then Eisenhower's years, and then the new frontier of Kennedy, the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, and then up into our own times with the Bushes, with Obama, and now Trump. But what is now the approach that people have about the role of government in society? Yes, I should be left alone in various ways, but the government has a responsibility to secure my retirement. The government has a responsibility to increasingly provide some safety nets, if not full coverage, for my health care. The government has a responsibility to either partially or even totally educate my child, kindergarten through the 12th grade, high school, as has long been presumed, rightly or wrongly, but now college. So it's from daycare through your PhD. It's the duty of the government to give you this education for free. There is the notion that government must supply housing, subsidize farmers, correct egregious wrongs in society through various entitlement programs and outreaches. Now, given this change mentality among the American people, it is not surprising that both candidates, in their own ways, with their own constituencies, their own coalitions of supporters, advocate the same directions of role of government and sets of policies. Do either Biden or Trump challenge Social Security? Do either Biden or Trump challenge a role for government in healthcare? What Trump might think it should be more of a, more private with some government support. Biden, obviously, there's a pressure from the left coming closer to, I believe, government, socialized medicine, the premise. Do either one of them challenge the role of government in education, in housing, in any of these forms of welfare redistribution of wealth? On corporate welfarism, that is, government transfers of money from the general public to business interest groups, do either one of them challenge protectionism and the need to protect American jobs and American industries from foreign competitors? Do either one of them challenge immigration restrictions? Now, Trump has had immensely bad press about this, but if you scratch Biden and get down to it, does he believe in really free immigration or even significantly free immigration? He was part of an administration under Obama, which was the first ones who set up those cages at the borders, which the Trump advocates have rightly pointed out. This was not created out of thin air by Trump. This has been a policy of many administrations. So the fact is that when we get to the base of it, in what ways do they differ, other than nuances and degrees and forms? And one other point, both of them believe in their own ways, in spite of their differing rhetorics at times, that is the duty and the responsibility of the United States government to play some form of a policeman in the world. Neither one of them wishes to withdraw American forces from foreign countries. Neither one of them wants to take a pledge of American non-military intervention in other places around the world. None of them want to take a pledge of saying an end to transfer of American wealth to other nations, either through foreign aid or military support of various and sundry sorts. The fact is, they both believe in the domestic and the international welfare interventionist state. And that means that given that mindset of, unfortunately, too many of our fellow Americans, what do they look for in candidates? Candidates who are going to give them some variations on these interventionist welfare state themes, and then a decision, well, do I like the interventionist welfarism of column A, or do I prefer more the interventionism and welfare of statism of column B? And that's where we are today in America.
Yeah, it's a matter of musical chairs. I mean, that you get one party in office and everything goes to pot because the system produces chaos, crises. And so everybody says, oh, this is terrible. What a poor manager. And of course, this is what Trump's strategy was before the pandemic of just make sure the stock market goes up and make sure the unemployment rate goes down. And that's all people would look at. Oh, if the stock market's going up, everything's fine. It's hunky dory and unemployment down. Boy, he's a great manager of the economy. Of course, then when everything crashes, oh no, it's not his fault. It's the pandemic fault. I mean, and of course, there are those that say, well, yeah, well, he mismanaged that because he predicted well. Well, the point is that the government shouldn't be managing the economy at all. But you've got two candidates there that believe in this management of the economy. You've got, as you pointed out, they both are fiercely committed to the welfare state way of life, especially Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. I mean, they're scared to death to even talk about slight cuts, much less abolition, which is what we libertarians favor. Because, of course, they are convinced that all of these socialist programs are freedom and free enterprise. I mean, it's really funny to see Trump calling Biden a socialist and Biden saying, I'm not a socialist. That's what Bernie Sanders is, when they all favor this welfare state way of life, which is a variation of socialism, not to mention all the central planning, which is a core principle of socialism, the Federal Reserve, central planning of money, the immigration system, central planning of movements of people, public schooling, classic central planning. Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned the 19th century, Richard, because bring up the 19th century. I think it's an important thing to do when we're advancing libertarianism. But yeah, I ought to warn you, though, you got to be prepared for attacks coming in from the reform-oriented segment of the libertarian movement, because whenever I bring up the 19th century, man, they have gone on the attack big time. And what they're saying is, oh, Jacob, you're saying that the 19th century was a libertarian panacea. Well, I never say that. That's what's so funny. Let me clarify it here. I'm not saying the 19th century was a libertarian panacea before all you reform-oriented libertarians come and attack me. What I'm saying is the 19th century showed that certain things are possible. Things like an income tax-free society. They lived without income taxes for more than 100 years. No Federal Reserve for 100 years. No paper money for 100 years plus. More than 100 years, gold coins, silver coins, the official money under the Constitution, no drug laws, no foreign interventionisms, at least in Europe, Asia, and so forth, no national security state. So why is all this important? Well, because we often get attacked saying, oh, what you guys are advocating at FFF is utopian, not possible. Well, it's ridiculous, because how can something be utopian or impossible when you can prove that has been achieved before? And so that's why I point to the 19th century and say, this is possible that we're advocating. You don't have to settle for reform. But the problem, of course, is that we've got Democrats and Republicans that have settled in and accepted the welfare warfare, conservatives, liberals, progressives. They say it's inevitable. They even call it freedom, when we libertarians know it's the exact opposite of freedom. So regardless of which of these two guys is elected, Richard, Biden or Trump, we're going to get the same type of system: the welfare warfare state, the drug war, the regulated economy, the managed economy, managed healthcare, just on and on, income tax, IRS, Federal Reserve, and so forth. And that really, it shows that democracy, which is the big thing for the mainstream press and liberals and conservatives, and democracy is not freedom. That democracy enables people to peacefully shift a regime, especially when the philosophy of the society switches. While when you have an unelected government, you have to go through revolution, which is very costly in terms of life and property and fortunes. So democracy is not freedom. Freedom is limitations on the powers of government to regulate, manage, and control peaceful activity. And that's really what we need to be doing in this country. And that's what we libertarians should be doing, is raising people's vision that what's important is not so much the person you're voting for, because you're going to end up with the same system, but how do we change the system so that we ensure a free society?
Well, I think that, if I can just hark back to this business of the 19th century a little bit. History is what it is. And in the real world, there's no sort of like extremes of just pure freedom and pure tyranny. Even in the most tyrannical societies, there are always the crevices or the interstices in which people end up finding little nooks and crannies of personal autonomy de facto, in which they can try to live and interact in various limited ways with others. Just as that in the freest society, there's always going to be some elements of statism creeping in or lurking in the corners. But the particular quality of the 19th century, and why it so stands out, whether you're a friend or a foe of the 19th century, is its comparison to the world that existed before it. ideas had been evolving about liberty for several centuries, the 1600s, the 1700s. What marked off the 1800s, the 19th century, is that these ideas came out of mere sort of discussions over a dinner table, like in France before the Revolution, in the French salons of the intellectuals meeting, like Voltaire and others, to the actual implementation of them, because a sufficient number of, quote, the intellectuals or the movers and shakers and the general public came to share this. And so what you saw was the shift from one person political rule, absolute monarchs, or oligarchs, if you count the powerful nobility around the king, to the idea of people having a right of self-rule. And the avenue for that was, as you just said, was seen as democracy. Let the people be able to express who they would want to be in positions of political authority in governmental office, and through that, directions of policy. But what marked off the spirit of the advocacy of democracy at that time, and this is another thing you were getting at, democracy itself is not liberty or freedom, is that what guided much of the democratic advocates of that time was adding an adjective to, and that was by classical liberalism. Well, liberal democracy is one that believes in self-rule, but what kind of self-rule? Not just the people vote and elect those who hold political office periodically, but the self-rule of the individual is recognized as an arena of autonomy of the person, which neither a majority nor a minority of others should have a right to interfere with and intrude upon, as long as the individual is acting in peaceful and voluntary collaborative ways with his neighbors for whatever purposes he's chosen for his life. So what the 19th century gave us was not just an emerging degree of political democracy or self-rule, and this obviously was extended as the voting franchise grew as to who is eligible to vote, but also the spirit of self-rule. The mercantilist regulations over economic activity were either abolished or radically loosened, or in the United States, within the territory of the US, virtually didn't exist. We had a free trade zone, though there was these roller coasters of high tariffs and low tariffs between the United States and the rest of the world for part of the 19th century. So people were given self-governing power over their economic affairs. The United States, in its constitution, was very direct about a separation of church and state. In early colonial America, there was religious persecution. There was oppression of freedom of conscience. But by the time of the Declaration of Independence and the writing and instituting of the Constitution, there was a separation of church and state in the highest law of the land. People could give financial support to the denomination of their choice, or they could give none. They could worship as they want and argue and debate and discuss and proselytize as they want, as long as they did it peacefully. And that was radically new. A king replaced his father in ancient times, earlier times. And if the son had been a secret Protestant because his father king had made Catholicism the official religion of all of his subjects, the next day the son now bears the crown, and he says, I've been the secret Protestant, now all my subjects have to be Protestants. And any Catholic is now going to be persecuted and censored. That was gone in the States. Freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of enterprise and trade. As you were saying, other than a small number of local and a very small handful of federal bases of taxes, basically whatever you earned was yours to spend or invest for future improvements of yourself and your family as you chose. This was a radically different conception. So that when people spoke of democracy in the 19th century, and that they often either added or implied the active liberal democracy, a democracy that believed in self-rule of both representation through election politically, but also the self-rule of each individual of an arena which neither a majority of private citizens nor a government could infringe with. And of course, to be protected in your life and property, even against one aggressor, which is what police and courts are about. This was a radically different world. People complained, but women didn't have rights. It is true that until the early 20th century, women did not have the right to vote in federal elections, required an amendment to the Constitution. But it is also the fact that women could own property as the 19th century progressed. Women could start and operate businesses on their own as the 19th century progressed. One of the major social subgroups of American society in the early and mid 19th century to fight the evilness of slavery were the women of the North. They were the organizers and participants in anti-slavery meetings, anti-slavery associations, the proselytizing of anti-slavery ideas. Obviously also men who opposed slavery, but women were the active ingredient. The men are working. The women, with all of their chores in a modern technical support of doing housework, they had a greater degree of autonomy. Women never had this degree of personal autonomy to speak their minds and participate without admittedly being able to enter to the voting booth, to participate and influence the political affairs of the country. Now, there was the issue of slavery, but slavery had existed for centuries. In fact, since the beginning of time. Aristotle himself said that in his Politics, that some men are naturally born free and others are naturally born slaves. Well, is Jacob Hornberger going to disagree with Aristotle? I mean, not even Mrs. Aristotle probably disagreed with Aristotle. But the fact is that beginning particularly in the mid-1700s through the end of the 18th century, arose a great anti-slavery movement, which worked hard to bring the end of slavery in the British Empire in 1833 through an act of parliament, and a groundswell of an abolitionist movement that had to fight a lot of resistance, not just in the slave South, but in the North, where slavery had been abolished by the end of the early years of the 1800s in all of the northern states. People who either passive or felt that it was good for the South and felt that blacks had shown themselves by being slaves inferior. What do you want to make them free and equal now? But there was this rising swell of opposition that all men are created equal, that all human beings should have the same latitude and liberty and rights before the law, and that slavery must end. This was new in history and was alive and vibrant and a driving force in America to end an institution that had existed literally from the beginning of time. This is what was radical. That is what, in my humble opinion, makes either the implementations or the spirit, when not fully able to be implemented immediately, which made the 19th century different from all other times. And America, with all of its contradictions, inconsistencies, and hypocrisies, unique as a country that had an ideal, a point on the horizon to which we were supposed to aspire, even if we're far away from that horizon and have not implemented yet, but are constantly, either in our words and especially increasingly in our deeds, trying to move towards it. That is what made America special in the 19th century. And those people who don't understand this or appreciate it, just to be honest, have not looked from the sweep of history of what existed before. It is always easy to criticize the past from your own perspective of current times. It is better to understand the rights and the wrongs, the contradictions and the triumphs and tragedies of any particular historical period if you compare it not to your achievements that came later, but what had existed prior to it. And by that standard, the 19th century is a hallmark of an epoch of either achieved or striving for liberty, before the counter-revolutions in the late 19th century of nationalism and socialism and the welfare statism mentality.
And the warfare statism and the national security statism, foreign interventionism, and so forth. Let me follow up on your point of religion, because I think it's very instructive. When we talk about freedom of religion, we don't talk in terms of complaining that the government's not running the religious system correctly. There's no fights over that issue of, well, the government should be doing this. It should be auditing the church books more closely, or it ought to revise its laws requiring children to go to church. And there's no fights over that at all. It's not, the fight is not over how the government is managing this system. Now, why is that? Well, because the government doesn't have the power to interfere with religious activities. The power is totally removed. So the issue isn't, are they managing their power correctly, wisely, prudently? It's, hey, you don't even have the power to interfere in this area of religion. And that's instructive if you take, for example, healthcare. You have even libertarians that are spending inordinate amounts of time complaining about how the government's running the coronavirus crisis. Oh, the masks, they're requiring us to wear masks. This is outrageous. And oh, the lockdowns are doing this with the lockdowns. And so, in other words, they're complaining about how the government is managing the system. That's not freedom. I mean, what their implicit suggestion is, boy, if we had a libertarian in there, that libertarian would be managing this system much better. Well, maybe, but it's still libertarian central management. And that if you want to talk about a free society, a genuinely free society, you've got to think in terms of healthcare the same way we do with religion, where we take the power to manage healthcare, to interfere with healthcare, regulate healthcare, totally out of the hands of the government, where the government just has no power at all to get involved in this area any more than it has the power to get involved in the area of religion. At that point, then the private sector comes about, that if people want to wear masks, fine. If a business wants to establish a wear mask policy for customers coming in, that's its business. For other businesses that don't want to do it, then everything is privatized the way it is in religion, where you have different churches, different groups. People are not required to go to church. Everybody makes his own decisions. That's what we need to keep doing, Richard, is not just complaining about the government mismanaging its power, but raising people's vision to a higher level and saying, let's separate, for example, healthcare in the state. So we have a First Amendment that says no law shall be enacted respecting the regulation of religion. No law shall be enacted respecting the regulation of healthcare. Now we're talking about genuine liberty.
Yeah, I think most viewers and listeners who live in the world in which we avoid the news realize that the degree of anger and polarization and notions of cataclysm are expressed and conveyed when politics is talked about today in American society. If the other side wins, it's the end of the world. If Donald Trump is reelected, ... If Joe Biden is elected, ... Why is there this degree of apprehension and fear and anger? It's precisely because the state is involved in so much of our daily lives. To be able to influence how we work, how we raise our children, how we plan for our future and our family circumstances and needs, so that if the other side wins, they may implement policies that are viewed by you as detrimental and harmful, and over which you have no control because they will do so through political power, and vice versa for the other side. Now, I recently wrote an article that will be in the November issue of Future Freedom publication about a German-American named Francis Leiber. He came to Germany in around 1827, and after being here for about 8 years, in around 1834, 1835, he wrote a book called A Stranger in America, about what he had experienced and learned and come to see as America in the form of letters to a friend back in Germany. And he says that there is often the heated rhetoric in political elections in the United States. Of course, this is the 1830s. But he's saying is that nobody fears the elections the way it still is in many European countries, that if there's a revolution or a radical political turn in those countries that already have certain representative systems, that those who will be defeated are threatened or with disaster for their lives. Because in America, in spite of the rhetoric, Leiber explains, everybody knows that everyone shares certain common views and values, such as a person's life, liberty, and property should not be threatened or attenuated by any anything that a representative elected to office might want to do. So that even though the rhetoric is heated, the fact is, you know that the election was not life and death, because the state did not regulate your economic affairs, did not intrude into religion, did not tell you how to live and how you could go about your personal attempts to guide and direct your own life. And the realization that if your candidate lost, and of course it was the spoils system then, the party came in and gave government crony jobs to their supporters. Of course, when the government is so small, the degree of cronyism is obviously very limited, like who's going to be the postmaster general or be the local head of the U.S. Post Office in some podunk nowhere of what would be Western America back then, known as Ohio, that type of thing. But if you lost an election or were thrown out as one of the rascals from some politically connected local job as a post office master, you know that it's this huge private sector. There's places to earn an alternative living and make a life for yourself, and nobody's going to come after you using the power of the state to crush you because you're the defeated victim in the election. Everybody feels this threat this way. If he's elected, what will happen to the school board, he's saying? Will learn about the Bible, or they will learn evolution? Will they have to say a pledge of allegiance, or will they not have to say a pledge of allegiance? If this fellow is elected, what happens to my health care? If this person elects, what happens to my retirement? If this person elects, what happens to my ability and how I run my business? So the very fact that politics has been intruded into every nook and cranny of our lives makes the outcomes of the election often seem to people life and death in relation to their values and views about things, which would be merely private affairs of everyone in how to manage their own life and associate freely with others if we lived in a land of liberty. So it's the politicization of everything that is one of the radical transformations of life now, compared to, admittedly, not that perfect society, but a less politicized society through a good part of the United States in the 19th century.
Yeah, I think that's very insightful. That's a very insightful point, that the fact that government can do so many bad things to us and so many good things for us makes the election of a president very, very important to people. And that in a genuinely free society where government would be prohibited from doing good things for people in terms of welfare and subsidies and so forth, or bad things to people in terms of torture and indefinite detention and so forth, most people wouldn't even care about the president. I mean, you wouldn't see these massive donations to presidents like you see from big businesses and corporations and to political parties and so forth, because the reason they do that is to protect themselves or to try to get part of the largesse. All right, Richard, we're out of time. On that note, we got to wrap things up, and enjoy the conversation. If you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org. 30 years of principled presentations of liberty, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And Richard, I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.